Hey there, welcome to another episode of Life Design Plus, where we are mastering the art of living your authentic life. I'm excited for you to dive into this conversation with my friend Adam Bruderly. You may remember Adam from a podcast appearance I made on Matt Ziegler. Yes, Matt Ziegler, the former guest. You hear his name a lot here. He has a podcast called Just Press Record, and he had Adam and I on to talk about whether or not you need trauma to find your authentic life and find your true self. Great conversation, and that is kind of the beginning of Adam and I's friendship now. We've had multiple conversations since then, and one of the things I think is really unique is the firm that Adam works at as the head of learning and development, Journey Wealth, has a really cool framework for what they define as wealth. It's basically spirit, mind, body, and money, in that order as well. So when I saw that their firm believed in that, and knowing that as head of learning and development in his role there, helping clients with a variety of ways of coaching and basically finding their way to passions and purpose, I thought we would have a very awesome conversation about this idea of wealth being defined in the realm of spirit, mind, body, and money. Obviously, I love that very much. So dive into this conversation. As always, leave something in the comments for Adam or for myself. You let us know what you took away from this conversation. And I even make an ask in the episode. Let us know if you want to hear more about this. We hit surface level. I see a world where there is an opportunity to do a series into each of these. So spend one conversation on spirit, one on mind, one on body, one on money. Dive deeper into each of these because it's a very deep idea and concept that we just scratched the surface on in about an hour's time. So let us know if you want more on this. I'm sure we would happily put together a series that we could co-brand and do together. So with that, let's get to this awesome conversation with my friend, Adam Bruderly. Like searching before, I wanted to make sure I had Journey Wealth's 4 pillars exactly right. And we're going to get to this in a second, but I did, Journey Wealth's 4 pillars of wealth. It pulled up some other 4 pillars. So I thought I would share those first 4 pillars I found, the 2 sets, kind of get some feedback from you, and then we can dive into what we both mutually agree is the 4 pillars of wealth, maybe of the future. And I have to admit, I am a little disappointed. Like I thought my spirit, mind, body, and money was like a unique idea. I should have known better. There is no unique idea. Everything's been said before, but it is kind of cool to see a firm like yours have that alignment. It's very similar to mine, even in the same order as we'll get to. So, but anyways, before we get to that, the first 4 pillars I found, I kind of deem them to be like the traditional 4 pillars or traditional planning. It's acquiring, protecting, growth, and passing along. And this was a post that somebody on LinkedIn wrote. So I don't know like how many people subscribe to this, but I thought they were good pillars. But to me, when I hear acquiring, protecting, growth, passing along, that's like traditional financial planning in my mind. What do you think about when you hear acquiring, protecting, growth, passing along? All very important things, all things I think show up when you have spirit, mind, body, money, but the focus is a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I think specifically for me, when I hear you share those 4 items, what I hear, it still tends to circle back around to that financial piece of it and wealth, meaning you're taking a slightly more nuanced approach, but it's still anchoring back in measuring, at least I think with dollars. And again, nothing wrong with that. And there is a nuanced component to each of those, right? Like if you think about like passing along or kind of what is next, right now you're thinking about that planning perspective and what comes from that generationally, or, then you can kind of extrapolate that a little bit farther to legacy, right? I tend to think, it makes me think a little bit about, the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon game. But you have to play the game. When you look at those pillars, you have to kind of play the game to get to the more nuanced pieces that I think you and I think about, where if you kind of flip it and you put it up front and you talk about the 4 pillars that you and I think highly align and agree upon, they're kind of front and center. You don't have to play that connection game, if that makes sense.
I would agree. I definitely think those 4, acquiring, protecting, growth, passing along, all lead to just focus on numbers. And they're all very important. Again, like those, we don't want to like neglect those, But when I see those four, what I think about is what's missing is like, what kind of life is that? And again, I quick research. I didn't dive deep into this guy's theory on all these, but when I hear those four things, it doesn't make me think about creating or designing a life that you as an individual really want. It's about accumulating a bunch of wealth. It's about protecting it so it doesn't go away. It's about growing it so you have more of it and then passing it on. But in those four, I don't see the ability to be creative with the life that you might want to live, which again goes back to traditional financial planning, which when I think about traditional financial planning, it's more about making life fit the numbers, where I think you and I are more about making numbers fit the life. Lead with the life, lead with the qualitative things, and then plug the numbers in. So again, nothing wrong, but it was interesting that four pillars came up right under Journey Wealth. The other four pillars I found, and maybe it's four types of wealth, but it kind of feeds into it, and it's a good bridge to where we're going to go, is financial, social, time, and physical. So financial would be money, and I think, again, it's more types of wealth. Social is status, time is freedom, and physical is health. So we got a little bit of ours in there. The one that jumps out to me on that is the social one, the status wealth. I think that's the one that is, I think that's almost problematic, because that's the type of quote unquote wealth that I don't really think matters, but a lot of people are benchmarked to that, and that does drive their decisions. And I have a belief that a lot of our money problems are coming from that social status part. Like, we're trying to be an image that we think people are supposed to be, so we buy the things that don't really align, and now we overspend and live above our means and all those types of things. So I throw it to you: financial, social, time, and physical as either four pillars or four types of wealth. What do you think about those?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree, especially with the last two, time and physical, right? However you extrapolate those, I think there's a great piece underneath that, time and physical. So physical, we know, is a critical component, right, of someone's pillars. And what I mean by that is you could take it 1,000 different ways, and I could rattle off a bunch of stats, which you've probably heard me speak to. But like, if that is not a part of your pillars, at some point, it's going to hold back all the things you want to do and how you want to get there. The financial piece, or if we're tying it back to time, you use the word, and it's funny. I wrote something that's coming out tomorrow. We've been talking a lot about I talk a lot about core values with a lot of my coaching clients, and it's a piece that we're integrating here at the firm. And my number one, to spoil my, hackney writing, to say the least, but my number one core value when I have done this, and I share it with others, either in kind of the coaching settings or just in general in conversation, and even talk to my family about, is freedom, right? Like, that is my number one. And it's funny, it often, like, it garners a reaction when you tell people about it, right? Because in a lot of work, I think when people do core values work, and I, happy to share how I do it, but when you use the words or the descriptions, like, a lot of people, it's family, it's love, it's children, it's spouse, right? Like, and those are all really important things. But for me, it's not; those actually don't bubble up to number one on my list when I rank or stack rank my 5. Freedom is number one, and I say that because if I have that, meaning, time or however you want to define it, then I can do all those things, meaning my family comes first, right? Like, my boys both played lacrosse and baseball this, spring and summer. I admit, whether, unless we had to double up, I was at every game. I helped coach my son's baseball team, right? My wife can have a busy schedule as a physician, right? So I'm getting the boys on the bus, getting them breakfast, walking them to school, whatever it is, getting them home, showing up at Forest Fridays, being a guest reader, the list goes on, spending time with my parents and being able to vacation with them and whatever it is. But because that is so important to me and influences who I am and how I make decisions, it allows me to then show up in all those other areas, meaning, how am I showing up with my 2 boys, and how am I showing up as a husband or a spouse or a son or, a assistant summer baseball coach for 8-year-olds. Like, right? I'm showing up not, stressed out and begging to take time off, or like anxiety ridden and on my phone looking at emails in the middle of it. Right? No, I'm there, right? Because I have that freedom piece. And that's a kind of long-winded to say I agree with those components. The one for me that sticks out on that is that social one you just referenced, and status, right? I think that's the one as a society that we're really struggling with, for a number of different reasons, which we'll probably speak on. But I talk a lot about in like kind of some virtues work. And this is not shocking. I loved a lot of David Brooks's work and things he shares, but I really think about it in three components, right? Balance sheet virtues, resume virtues, and eulogy virtues. And I think when it comes to status, a lot of people think about those balance sheet virtues and those resume virtues, and we really struggle with eulogy virtues. And I think it's probably a couple things. Like, we as humans, right, we're used to measuring. And when I would say measuring, right, like you can see it on a piece of paper. It's why it is so easy to get caught in that trap of like, what's your title? What's your income? What what car are you driving? What house are you living in? What's your street? What's your neighborhood? What schools did you go to, right? Like, they're easy to measure and stack rank. The same with all the other things, but when it comes to those resume virtues, right? Like, it's hard. Like, did I show up as a kind person? It's hard to measure. And that's the one that I think we really, society as a whole, and just in this world that we're in, meaning the wealth management or advice world, we can have a lot of impact on in reframing perspective. It's a very long-winded answer to your
No,
question.
it was great. I would add a fourth virtue to it, and this is like, so I would name it like the like unknown virtues. So like, to me, eulogy virtues could be kind of unknown. Like, there might be things that come up in your eulogy that people didn't know. Like, it came out after Peyton Manning left Indianapolis about how much he gave to the community. Like, there's a children's hospital named after him, so we know that, but he gave a lot back to the community and never publicized it. And that it came out after the word, but that could be something that someone does that comes out in their eulogy about this great work. But then there could be other things you've done through your life that no one ever knows. Like, you take it to your grave, and maybe one person who you helped, they know that unknown virtue. I don't know if those are more important than the eulogy virtues or not. Like, should we strive to do unknown virtues, because then we're doing those things and reaching those accomplishments, if you will, because of the real reason, like because it's a good thing to do and no one even finds out about. Like, that to me, that's almost kind of like the highest level of consciousness, like above love on David Hawkins's scale. So if you ever want to throw that in there, feel free to use it.
I will still. I mean, and it's funny you say that, right? Like, there's some work in like the psychology space, or I'd actually even say it's kind of spiritual, and the person who's kind of did the work, I apologize, it's kind of skipping my brain, but it's like in that third phase, right? There's kind of three phases of it. It's pre-personal, personal, and that last one is self-transcendence. And I think that's what you're saying, right? Like, you start to see that there is this greater whole out there. I'm a part of it, but just a part of it. It's not all me, right? Like, there's this whole other component, and there's an amazing human, and I say that just as a observer of things I have read and followed, but his name was Charles Feeney, and if you're familiar with his name, but he was the founder of Duty Free. And right, like, you get off the international flight, or you go through, and those duty free stores, like, that was him. And I think he amassed at one point, his fortune was somewhere between like $8 or $9 billion, right? He passed away last year, I believe. And when he passed, I think he had 3 million. He gave it all away while he was alive, anonymously. And what's truly amazing about it is only 1% of all gifting is anonymous, right? And I think what you just said, right? Like, it is great. I mean, whether you give it away and your name gets slapped on the building or not, I mean, it's still the great thing. But that was someone who just realized that like it's beyond me, and that this is who I am, and this is what I want to do, and I don't need anything for it other than intrinsically looking inside. This is the expectation I have of myself. Um, and I mean, if you get the chance to read some of the stories, right? Like people people from his group would show up with like a $10 million cashier's check to some foundation and be like, where did this come from? They're like, well, somebody just really liked what you were doing, and you're just like, that's wild in my brain to think about anymore these days, right? But I think that's what you're referring to, and I would agree, right? Like, we didn't find out to the very end that that's what he was kind of up to, or broadly, people didn't find out, and you hope there's more of that, right? That's the piece of it.
Interesting. I was today years old when I found out that duty free was actually a brand and not just what they were telling you. I didn't realize that was a brand. Had no idea. That's awesome. But yeah, he was doing it for the real reason of doing it. And to your point, I don't necessarily think that sharing that you are giving is always a bad thing. Like I do think that in that, people talk about virtue signaling things. Like sometimes there's good because by putting your name behind something or sharing that you didn't act like that, you inspire somebody else to do it. So if you do it anonymously and no one knows, then maybe there's a missed opportunity to encourage somebody else to follow. But I feel like when you can tell when people are doing it for the gram or if they're really sharing it because they want to drive attention to a good cause. But that's awesome. I want to circle back in a little bit to the core value work because you mentioned that. But I think that'll kind of come up as we dive into what we would say are 4 pillars of wealth according to us. And I'll be honest, when I came up with spirit, mind, body, and money, I connected them to finance. Obviously, money is a part of it and fixing it, but I didn't necessarily consider that the definition of wealth. Like I've talked to back in the day, I've written and talked about difference between rich and wealthy. And like to me, rich is money and bank account stuff, and wealth is like the bigger picture, your family life and all those types of things. So I can't fully claim to have spirit, mind, body, money as a definition of 4 pillars of wealth, but it was very, very connected. Journey Wealth, you wrote and shared it. Your pillars of wealth are spiritual wellness, mental wellness, physical wellness, and financial wellness. And what I think is absolutely wild, and this is a working example of alignment and synchronicities, is it's spirit, mind, body, money. And that's the order I've intentionally put my alignment. Usually you hear like, what is it? Now I can't even say more. It's mind, body, spirit. I think is the way you hear people normally say it, but that's so ingrained to me. It's spirit, mind, body. But I was intentional with the way I did it. Was Journey intentional? Is there a reason it's spirit, mental, physical, financial, or did it just kind of shake up that way?
I would say I'd love to say I'm a soothsayer, right? Like I have this whole kind of forecast. I think it was the way it showed up, but 2, there wasn't a level of intentionality to it, and we can dive into it, right? But when you think about those 4, I think foundationally just to start, those were 4 that came out foundationally, because if you think about whatever you're looking to get to, and when I say that, whatever you want your life to look like, be it tomorrow, or be it 5 years, or be it 30 years from now, those are the 4 pillars that need to be aligned, strong, and kind of anchored to the foundation of living the place you want to be, or where you want to get, right? Like you need those 4. And I think the mistake, that I use the proverbial we, right? Kind of very loosely, but like we think some of those are mutually exclusive, and they are not. And I think spiritual is the one that I think at times we can get nervous using that term, right? Because it can be, I don't know if the term is loaded or hijacked or whatever you want to talk about, right? Because it has a certain connotation and meaning. But what's important when we talk about that one here is it's really anchoring to your to your why, right? It's your greater purpose. The interesting piece, and it ties to the theme of journey, right? And kind of that name and who we are. But to get whatever that is, there's a lot of different paths you can take to that why. So I just preface that as the one, but yeah, there was a level of intentionality, I think, to it.
Yeah, definitely in finance, spirituality is not something that most financial advisors want to talk about. And it is loaded. It starts to bring in religion and faith, which, that can get messy. But when I think about the spiritual part, I made it first because as I was going through my personal pursuit, but AKA journey, in kind of figuring things out, I became more spiritual and more in touch with my true self. And so to me, it's like, okay, if I'm going to find my authentic life, which is ultimately what my goal is for everybody, and I think it's very similar to what you just described, I need to be connected to the source that created me. And whatever your belief system is, that fits there. So it doesn't matter what your denomination is, if you have a denomination, whatever the creator is that you believe in. Connecting to that, I think, is done through a spiritual connection. So you need to start there, because if you can connect to that higher power and you are aware and open, you will ultimately realize what it is you're supposed to be doing, what your calling is, what your purpose is. I think that it tells you, because it created you for a reason. So it will tell you what your reason is, but that's the first step, is having that connection. And the next step is, for me, the mind, which, between spirit and mind, that encompasses emotional. I think emotional health, I think, to me, falls into maybe mental and body. But on the mind part of it is, I am such a big believer in the power of our mind that if you have this connection with your higher power and you have this calling and you believe in it, well, take that back. You have this calling, but you don't believe in it. Your mind doesn't believe you can go do it. Then you're never going to go do it. So having the connection to your spiritual power is great. But if your mind can't believe that that's what you're going to do, that's what you're supposed to do, then you'll never actually see it happen. The saying, I'll believe it when I see it, and it's not the case. It's you'll see it when you believe it. You will become that person you were supposed to be when you believe that's who you are. So that's why the mind comes next. Body comes in. We have to be physically able to carry this out, so we need to be taking care of our body. But also, I think if we're not taking care of our body, then those physical ailments we have can put a strain on our mental and pull our mind out of alignment with our spirit. So it all needs to be working together. And on the body part of it, we'll talk about it, because I know you guys do some unique things at the firm. To me, it's doing the best that we can to take care of our body. Like, you hear the stories of the marathon runner who only ate organic food, never ate, never drank, and has a heart attack or gets cancer. Like, there are certain things that are just totally out of our power, but there's a lot of things that we as a society are bringing to ourselves because of the choices we make, whether it is diet, nutrition, whatever it may be. So to me, it's about trying to do the best that you can with all of the knowledge that we have to take as good of care of your body as possible to keep that alignment. And then the final piece for me, and why money is last, is I think it's the least important, not to minimize the importance that it has, but when you have that alignment, you have greater clarity of who you are, what you value, what you want. And I think that it helps you better align your dollars, so you don't worry about that status that we were talking about earlier, because now it doesn't matter, because you know who you are, you're secure in that, you're confident in that, and you don't have to spend dollars to impress people. And then the final piece of it is, I also think money sorts itself out when you are living your authentic life. So I wrote about gifts and talents recently on the Daily Notes. And so I think we have gifts and talents that are important. So for me, I have gifts and talents that make me a financial advisor. I'm a good financial advisor, but those gifts and talents are shared with other financial advisors. Meaning, if something happened to me, somebody could come into my shoes and they might not be able to fulfill the relationship aspect with my clients the same way, but they can crunch the numbers. So that's a gift and talent shared. But what I've realized in the last couple of weeks is my unique gifts and talents, which are the ones that I've been trying to find and move towards that make me different from everybody else, is my creativity. It's my love of creating content and storytelling, my energy, the inspiration that I somehow inject to other people. Like, that is my unique gift and talent. And what I realized is like being a financial advisor, if I want to meet my financial goals for my authentic life, being a financial advisor will get me pretty far. We live a great life. I have no complaints, no wants. But the next level of financial growth for me is to give back like Peyton Manning and people not know about it, do those unknown virtues that I mentioned. And I need to increase my income to do that. I believe that the best way for me to reach that level of financial, success or whatever you want to call it is not through financial planning alone. It's through leveraging the creativity, the content creation, storytelling. Like that is what makes me unique, which therefore, if nobody can do it as well as me in the right situation, then that allows me to be more valuable to the world, to a company, which will increase my income. So long-winded way to explain this, but that alignment and living the authentic life can allow you potentially to command a higher dollar because you do something better than anybody else because only you can do it that way. And then the other final one, and then I'll pause because I got long-winded and I'm supposed to be a good host and not do this, but this is not like interview. This is like us having a conversation. And then the final piece of it is I also think that going back to the status thing, when you're comfortable, you realize I don't necessarily need as much money as I thought because I was spending, X amount of dollars a month on a car that I don't really enjoy to impress people. And, the list could go on that you might realize, hey, I can cut this much money out of my need because I don't really need it and we would still be okay, which could change the way that you work and all these other things. So I really do think that alignment of spirit, mind, and body and the clarity that brings and the direction that it brings solves or makes money a lot easier once you get past the threshold of covering your basic needs. Like that is a certain level. Once you get past that, I think it solves a lot of money troubles.
Yeah, agreed. One of the things that popped into my head, and you've probably already heard this, but like be one of one, right? Like I think that's what you were saying, right? Be one of one.
Got a hoodie for that.
I like that. I'm a hoodie guy. But that's it, right? Like like people say follow your passion, right? Like, of course, that is important, but you also there has to be value in that passion. And I think that's what you're saying, right? Like, be one of one, meaning, hey, if there's a certain component of passion, but also you're really good at that, right? Like, the value will then bubble up and be there. It's that value stack that you've probably seen the consultants who have extrapolated and made like these diagrams of, but it's true, right? Like you want to be up here, and you kind of shared that like when it came to financial advice, right? Like there is a baseline standard, and there's the next. I did some of this work in my previous career, right? But if you look at the evolution of financial advice and you go back, probably 25 years, it was like, hey, it was a certain amount of, how you buy a stock, how you buy a bond. And then you kind of saw the introduction of mutual funds kind of coming in there. And then it moved slowly a little bit into kind of a very loose term of financial planning. And then we kind of migrated to a little bit broader and deeper financial planning, introduction of model portfolios. We're getting kind of a little esoteric here. But I swear there's an end point because it's like, what is next in that value stack? Because if you look at commoditization of all of that over time, and you and I have seen it, and it's really sped up the last 5 years. I mean, I think, for example, when you look at what the decision Schwab made a few years ago when they said no transaction fees, and the ripple effect that caused on the industry pretty quickly, right? Like, well, the value, that value is gone. Like if I can just go buy that anywhere with no okay, like any value that some of the other providers offered maybe disappeared. And that is evolving. And I think that's what you're saying when we're talking about all these other components, right? Like why the pillars are so important, why integrating this into your life and what is happening is so critical from that perspective.
All right. I told you it was a great conversation. I will keep this interruption short, but I want to bring your attention to my singles of the summer. Now, you all know I love hip hop, and I would love to be a rap artist or just even a producer making beats. But that is not where I am at today. I don't have the time to learn that, and I haven't tapped into that level of creativity. But what I have tapped into is some creativity around I'll say spoken word poetry. So every Friday, I am dropping a single, and I have for the last 5 or 6 weeks, which right now has been a spoken word poem with a little bit of music to it. Head on over to Life Design Plus, the podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you're listening to this on your podcast, and you'll scroll up and down, you'll see the episodes. They have different thumbnails if you're watching this or if you're listening to it on Spotify. But every Friday, I'm going to drop a single. And some of these singles are going to begin to be shorter talks. So not just a spoken word poem, but an actual talk that I would give in person, that I'm just going to give in my studio and then put it out as a single. My way to get into more public speaking, even without having to be on stage. So check out the singles. I'm having a lot of fun there, and I have some cool ideas for them in the future, how these can continue to grow. So with that, head on over. The singles of the summer, every Friday. They will be showing up on YouTube over time as an edited video with some other B-roll. And if you follow me on Instagram, and I do TikTok sometimes, I'm putting videos there as well. And if you do follow me on Instagram, every Wednesday sometime, I don't know when it will be, I'm recording the poem live on Instagram. So you can watch me behind the scenes, see if I mess up. You can watch it live there. The replay will be there as well. So the singles of summer are live and they're coming. There'll be another one for you this Friday. All right, let's get back to this conversation with Adam. Passion is something that I'm a big fan of, and people have opinions on it. And I mean, I have opinions as well, but I also operate in a world where I don't believe there's absolutes. So, but I think if you get that alignment of spirit, mind, and body, and you really tap into that, I have to believe that the thing you were created to do better than anybody else will naturally be a passion of yours, because like you're being guided there and you're supposed to do it. So obviously you're going to enjoy it. Now, where the passion can kind of become problematic is as you're trying to figure out what that is, like maybe your passion, maybe what you think is your passion is not really a passion. It's more of an interest that you've mistaken as a passion, but I still think you follow it. And I'm an example of that. Like you go back over the last 9 years that Arliss Wealth has been in existence and go look at All About Your Benjamins and look at the things I wrote about and what I wrote, look at the different business models I tried. Like I wandered as a financial advisor, following interests, following things I thought were passions, and that led me to where I sit today, where I have no doubt that like this is the version of me I'm supposed to be. So I think following passions are good. I also think sometimes you have to be careful and you have to have enough self-awareness to know when to pivot back and when not to keep going. But I hate, like Cal Newport says, don't follow your passions. Go find something you're good at and passion will develop. And that is true because when I look at my life as a financial advisor, that's exactly what happened. I stumbled into the business and developed a passion for the work maybe 6 years in. And what I think I realized is I developed a passion for the relationships and the helping of people, and maybe not so much a passion for the numbers. Like I enjoy the numbers, but the passion is on the other things. So I think that is true, but I think it's disingenuous to tell somebody who has a passion, has found that thing, and maybe the how of how that becomes a moneymaker for them isn't there yet. But if you tell them don't follow that passion, they never get to be the person they're supposed to be. So I think passion is important. I think it's left to the individual to determine how much that passion needs to be a part of their life. I do think you need to explore it. I do think it's a guide, but you've got to be able to know yourself and kind of realize when it's not what it's supposed to be. And for some people, maybe their passion is not supposed to be their career because then no longer becomes a passion. So lots of comments there. Today's is not about passion. Maybe we'll have another podcast in the future about passion. But you said that, and it just made me think about all that.
And I would agree. It's funny because I think what you just shared is a little like it's in our what we call the personal journey. It's our kind of coaching program, right? Mm-hmm. And you talk like one of the phases, for lack of a better term, is evolution. Meaning, I think what you just shared in your own perspective, right?
Hold up, I got to interrupt. I have to interrupt. I don't know if you saw me smirk. I think people who have never experienced synchronicities and things like that don't believe it's real. But let me tell you why I smirked and I rudely interrupted you.
All right.
Today's daily note, maybe you wrote it, but I guarantee it's not why you mentioned that. Today's daily note was a poem that I wrote called It's an Evolution. And it's based off of my talk from last fall, Evolving with Your Authentic Life. So my daily note, which I also, before we recorded, performed, that'll be on social media later as my little side video, and it will be Friday's single that I dropped on the podcast, is about evolution. And here you are talking about evolution. Like, that's not coincidental that today I talked about that and then you bring it up. So anyways, back to your story. I just wanted to point that out so people can see, like, when you have that alignment, there are so many signs that are guiding you that if you're there to pick it up. And like what that means, I don't know. It just means that I'm in alignment. And like, it's not a coincidence that I wrote that and you talked about that.
Well, and it's right, because I think that's a piece of it, because I think what you shared was extremely thoughtful, meaning, right, like, you don't chase something just for like to be an expert at it, and maybe you don't chase something just because it's purely your passion. It's like many things, right? It kind of often falls right in the middle, and the integration of those two to kind of find where your, for lack of a better term, your interest lies, where your passion aligns, and you're really good at it, takes time. And I think that's kind of what you were saying, right? Like, it took time for you. It took a long time for me sitting here to be able to have the opportunity to sit in this chair and get up every morning and feel like I am bringing value, hopefully, to someone's life. And even if no one was listening other than my wife, and she gets pretty sick of it, like, I would be talking about all of these things, right? Like, I would. And it's something, if the stack of books behind me, or at home in my office, or the podcast I listen to on the way to work, or all the goofy things in my notebook, right? Like, I would be doing this anyways. And I think that's it. And it took me, when I say evolve or evolution, it took me a long time, but it was kind of sticking with that passion, finding something that I was decent at, learning the things that got me here, that kind of set me up. So I think it's a long-winded way to say I, wholeheartedly agree with that connection from that perspective.
So we both have a passion for spirit, mind, body, money, and how that happens, and that being a measure of the wealth that we want to see people strive for. Like, how are you helping clients, evaluate those, address them, plan them? Because I don't know if this has been your experience, and I've been loosely incorporating these things, sometimes not even knowing it, but like really my focus over the last year and a half has become this type of work with life planning. So I don't have a lot of clients that we are intentionally having these conversations. I don't know if everybody comes to a financial advisor thinking about talking about these things or even wanting to. And because they're not coming, they might not even know the answers. So I guess maybe first, are you experiencing people knowing what their spiritual wellness is like? And like, do they know that, or do they know what they really want out of life, or are they just kind of going with the program that we've all been programmed with? What are you guys seeing?
I think, right, like many things, when you think about like a bell curve, right, you of course have people on, both tails, right? Like, they do have a strong understanding of what's important, what they want, where they want to go, and what they want to be. And then you have that other side, right, of just, kind of not sure about anything. And then you have a lot in the middle. And there's a little bit of a framework that we speak to, or I use in some of the workshops, in some of the work we do, but it's kind of this like spectrum of within the mental wellness landscape. And it's like, if you think about where people are, right, there's this whole left side, right? I don't want to use the term, but it's like, hey, like just mentally struggling, for lack of a better term. And the far right is a term that we use a lot, but flourishing, right? Like, and I love that term for a lot of different reasons we can talk about. And then in the middle is like languishing, and it may sound a little harsh, but I think it's just it's a word that can be used to describe like, hey, I'm here and I'm showing up, and I'm not sure of a lot of other things. And I think a lot of people fall in that space. And again, not to say, I don't use it as a derogatory term, but if you just think about your friends, for example, or the people you talk to, right? How many are like, hey, I got to go to work tomorrow. I'm not really excited about it. Or Yeah, my kids are playing, at a doubleheader and it starts at 8 a.m. and it's just a long day and right. Or yeah, my parents are coming to visit, I'm tired of them after 2 days or right. Like you've probably heard a number of those examples. And that's what I think about when I see like kind of sitting in that middle. And I think advisors or hear that, as friends, you hear that from your friends or your peers, family member, right? Like you hear those stories and it's like, how do we take those stories and move them to that flourishing side? And
We can't. You and we
right.
can't. We can only help them. Like they have to discover it themselves, which I think the spirit, mind, body component is a part of that. Like that's all in internal reflection, but we can't do it. They have to do it for themselves. And that's something I had to learn. I probably learned in the last couple of years. Like there's certain problems I can solve, like how much to maximize your 401k and like that type of stuff. But like when it comes to moving to the flourish side, that's not my job to tell you what to do. I just here to help
Yeah, and
you.
I think that's the unique piece. And what I mean by that is I agree wholeheartedly, right? Like people don't change until they're ready to change. But what we can do, and I think this is the important piece of it, is we can help them change. And we can do that in a lot of different ways, right? We can just be there planting seed after seed after seed until the sun and the rain and the good weather comes and it's ready to grow, right? We can give them the tools to help them change. And what I mean is, if we can help them, if someone's willing to at least start to learn and seek and grow, right? Like we can start to give them the tools to recognize where they are. And once they have that level of self-awareness, then they can start to really understand where do I want to go and how do I get there. That there's a lot of that in a lot of learning loop models, meaning like, hey, in order to kind of either break something or start something, you have to have like starting with self-awareness. Like that's the critical piece of it. And then, like those are two examples and it kind of extrapolates out from there, right? Whether, just being a listener for people, right? Like being that kind of sounding board, that steward or that guide, and then, connecting the pieces for them. And what I mean by that is if you think about like, and you do this better, right? Because I'm not an advisor per se. But and you've heard this, right? And I'm extrapolating out, so correct me if I am wrong. But right, I'm sure you've been in a meeting, and especially the last few years, as you've gone like much farther into the life planning space, right? Like you've heard or recognized something from a client, and it's like, oh, okay, I see what this actually means. Like, how can we take that reflection, turn it into like an inflection point, and then put them on the path they want to go on, right? And whether you do that to your point or whether you introduce something that helps do that. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. And I use the term loosely because I haven't come up with a more creative term, but it's like I call it a collective, right? And it's this group of resources and people that we want to surround our clients with to help them into that flourishing space. I often start there, as the coach at the firm, but that doesn't mean it has to come through me specifically, right? It starts in the, onboarding process and in conversations, and, it may not take hold, but they know it's here, and where does that go from there? So, just trying to paint the picture that I think I agree, right? Like people don't change until they're ready to change, but there's a lot of things we can do to help them start to want that change.
I use the planting seeds all the time. I talk about planting like a forest, and I try to get as many trees planted so you walk into one sooner and like have these realizations. The podcast, like this conversation is one of those, is to get people to thinking about, oh, what's my definition of wealth? And is it the old school one? Is it the status one? Should it be that? Like getting just people to like to think and reflect is the beginning piece. So let's talk more about Journey and what you guys are doing as far as implementing spirit, mental, physical, financial wellness with clients. Like how are you bringing that to them and helping them, and go wherever you want with it, whether it's like, here's how we're helping them evaluate it, here's how we're incorporating it. Like how are you bringing this to your work? Because I love that.
Yeah.
Obviously.
It's been to be honest, it's been a little bit of a windy road, right? Getting it here. And what I mean by getting it here is like integrating it in. I think you and I have talked a little bit about this, but from an industry perspective, it is a little nuanced and new. Using like, hey, I'm talking to my advisor in the firm about mental wellness and spiritual and physical, right? It can feel a little bit awkward, but it really starts, and it's starting to integrate into the process, even in our planning methodology. And what I mean by that is, when clients come in, right, and you start to have that initial conversation with them of what really got them here, right? So either current clients or new clients, like how did you end up here, right? There's a reason, meaning you're seeking out advice for something specific, and that question really kind of starts to open the dialogue of, okay, what brought you here and how can we help? And from there, that's when we really start to kind of have those deeper conversations. And some of that starts in some of the fundamental work, meaning, hey, if you decide that, this feels good and the connection is there, what gets incorporated within that? And we are talking, for example, in those conversations about core values, right? Like that's a key piece. It's something that I think, organizations do, companies do, people do, right? Like families do. It's just an important piece because, whatever your core values are, right? You either, it's reinforcing how you live, the things you believe in, what you teach your children, the things you have been taught, right? It's really kind of a foundational component of how you want to live life now and in the future. So we do talk a little bit about that. The other piece of it is the reframing or definition of wealth. And right, like people end up in an advice firm because of investments and cash flow and balance sheets, liquidity events, and a multitude of other things, right? But what we also want to know is what is your true definition of wealth? And what I mean by that is it the balance sheet and investments, or is it like, hey, time, right? Like, am I connecting the dot that if I have more of this, it gives me more of this? Or is it, if I have more of this, meaning like, hey, the balance sheet stuff, then I need to spend more time growing it even higher, right? Like that happens, and it happens more often than we think. So those are two kind of foundational conversations that get integrated in. And then it kind of leads into what does your vision look like, right? And there's another multitude of things, right? Because now we have gotten a little bit here and a little bit there in that kind of that conversation that integrates into your plan, leading to kind of us understanding better what you are trying to achieve and what you want life to look like, right? Because most of the time, for example, the question's like, hey, when can I retire and how much will I have? And that's good, but I think when we started this conversation, it's exactly what you said, is tell me what you actually want that life to look like, right? For example, if you're like when the time comes and what you love to do is to go camping every weekend, fishing, right, and hiking and running, right? Like, okay, right? Like if that's your passion, that's what you want to do every single day, you don't need $50 million in your account, right? Like you just like that is a very like nuanced thing that if you have a place to go to do it, it's kind of a lower cost component, right? All right, so now we understand that like that's an important piece because we know like that does factor into what you want your life to look like, right? And those are the good ones, right? The other ones are the other side of, I have this liquidation event of this business, and it's going to allow me to retire. And when I retire, we're going to have this vacation house, and I'm gonna play golf every day, and I'm gonna do all these other things, right? And then we actually, okay, we heard you, and then we look at where you are now, and why are you buying this vacation house? So my whole family can come visit. But you've spent the last 20 years just grinding away, not engaged in those familial relationships, right? Ignoring perhaps, like not spending the time, focused on the business. You know, is everyone coming to visit and spend all that time with you just because now you're ready to go? I don't know, right? Like that's a tough question. So
So in that scenario, like what's really cool, I want to hop in because it made me think about like life planning. So like when I think about like life planning the Kinder way, because that's the only way I know how to do, and I'm drunk on that Kool-Aid, like it's not just like, it's not the stopping point of why do you want the house? Oh, so my family can come. It's like, well, why is that so important to you? And because they already know that they were grinding and they missed out. Like the real why probably is I feel guilty that I was absent for the last 20 years and I want to have this great house to be able to make up for that. And I think the reason, like in that scenario with exit, like maybe there's nothing they can do prior, but if somebody has that goal, let's say maybe you met that founder 10 years in instead of 20, the business is booming, things are great. He already knows he's missed 10 years and you have that conversation then, and you get him to realize that the real reason he wants the beach house is because he feels guilty about missing the last 10 years. Now that emotional reason is out in the clear, you guys can address that. And now what potentially, and this is why it's so amazing, is you might give that gentleman or woman 10 years with their family they would have missed because you pointed out that like, oh, like maybe you don't really need the beach house. Maybe you need to work less to be with your family. And the beach house isn't no longer a goal because you're not making up for lost time. And so like, that's what I love about life planning is that it is like traditional planning is, what do you want? A beach house. Great. You need this much money. Like, getting deeper qualitative work, like I was doing it without really knowing I was doing it, is like trying to understand a little bit more for my sake. Like the real reason is getting you, Mr. and Mrs. Client, for you to understand why you want it. Not just like, what is the emotion driving that want? Because then that opens up a lot of things that we can talk about. And that is, I think, what's going to allow you to really figure out what's most important, what your values really are. And I want to have you walk through a core value work because that may be part of kind of what helps people figure these things out. But like, as you were saying that, I was like, yes, yes, yes. And then like the next level is getting him to realize the real value of that beach house is not for people to come. It's to try to make up for all that time you missed.
And not getting sucked back in, right? Like exit one, ooh, I really liked this. I want to do this again. Well, why do you want to do this again? Is it I saw someone else sell their business for more than what I just sold for, so I got to go back in, right? Like what is it? I could cite like example after example, right?
Or exit comes around and multiple is not what I think it should be, so I'm going to stay in a few more years to drive that multiple up greater. But it's like, is your financial plan goal, now that you know these things about yourself and your values, is your financial plan still to maximize value, or is it to maximize living? And if it's to maximize living, who cares if you get 1 or 2x less? Like, yeah, there's a quantifiable thing, but if what you're going to get gives you everything you need and more, what is the point of the other two if you've told me you feel bad missing out on 20 years of time with your family? Right. And like, so I love the idea of maximizing life versus maximizing the numbers, unless that's the person's goal. And that may be some people's goal, and that's totally fine. Although I would push and say, if your goal in life is to maximize your net worth, there is something trauma-wise really, really deep in you that's really causing that. Like, I don't think anybody's anybody was created to maximize their net worth, like beyond a certain point. I think that there's something else that they're trying to make up for that causes that. But again, that could be for another one. We need to get through mental, physical, financial, how you guys are incorporating all that.
Hopefully that provided a good context, just kind of like, because that vision piece is the key, right? Like what you were asking is that vision piece is the key piece of like telling people, okay, what do you want life to look like? Once we understand that, and leading into what you said, like those 4 pillars, because those 4 pillars will build the foundation of that specifically. Meaning we want to know, okay, once we paint that picture, the 4 components of that being spiritual, mental, physical, and financial, right? So when we better understand what that life looks like, then we can start to extrapolate underneath that and say, hey, okay, in 30 years, like, if you still haven't defined your why, or what your purpose is, or what drives you, like you're going to be struggling. We know, for example, like when people retire, right? Like your all-cause mortality actually increases if you don't have something ready to go, because that purpose gets lost, right? Within the mental wellness framework, right? Like we break it into emotional and social. Like when we could talk about that, emotional is pretty easy to understand. The social one right now is really a rippling effect, right? Like we're seeing that across the board. You know this, but like the Surgeon General about 18 months ago announced we have a loneliness and isolation epidemic in the United States. That is a big piece. So like, are you doing the work in that space? Like, what does that framework look like? Back to those people putting 70, 80, 90 hours a week in, right? Like, how do you maintain your social relationships in that type of world? Physical, right? Like extrapolating that out, like there's a multitude of things. We could just talk about the Fidelity study, the most recent one. Like if you retire at 62, you need $350,000 to $370,000 in healthcare costs. If you're just average, right? Like, and I could cite stat after stat in the United States that unfortunately, predominantly, we are not average, right? Like we are struggling from a health perspective.
And average is bad. It's not really good. Yeah. So that's what's sad.
I could rattle off stat after stat, right? Like on that space, and then the financial one, which is pretty straightforward. So,
well, I love that you guys have that. I mean, obviously, I'm biased because I love spirit, mind, body, and money, and I think it's really, really cool that Matt Ziegler got us connected, because he had us on that podcast, and I had never come across Journey or you, and I'm like, man, these are my people. So, well, I want to leave the audience with something to. There's hopefully plenty to take away from our conversation. It's just thoughts, diving into your definition of wealth. What are you doing for your spirituality, your mentalness, your body, your finances? How do those align? But like an exercise, and we don't have to go through the whole core value work, but what is something that somebody could take from today's episode to kind of begin to dive into their core values from the way you kind of help people do that? And maybe it's just having a conversation or questions you would ask, what are some ways that we can tap into your core value work?
Yeah, I think it's, one, I would tell people if they're interested, right, just Google. You can literally Google or use a chat GPT and start with hey, core values exercise, right? There are plenty out there on the internet. All of them are nuanced, but all of them are similar. But a great way to start is just there, right? You can, one thing I tell clients, and we do from a worksheet perspective, is we have this whole list of words. And I tell them circle 20, right? Just start there. What 20, when you see them on the page, appeal to you? And whatever those are. And it's for people who haven't done that work in the past, it's important to kind of start broadly, because there's a lot of words on there that they probably don't even think about or intertwine or apply, right? It's a good kind of hey, getting them going, getting the kind of the juices flowing and thinking about. From that 20, we then narrow down to 10, right? And now we're saying, hey, when you think about your own life, let's give me 10 more from that list of 20 that really start to hone in for you or kind of important. Again, it's just kind of that old funnel. And then the last piece is like, give me your five from that and stack rank them. And this is where it gets a little bit harder for people, because I'll often see people who they'll kind of on the lines, they'll write like three words down for their first one, right? They are literally struggling like, well, it's this, but it's this, and it's this, and it's this. And so we'll get them to the five. And then I asked the question of, okay, for that number one, like, tell me how it is showing up in your life. How are you living it now? Right? I need an example, a specific example of how this value that you say is so important, how are you living it, or how is it showing up? Because this is kind of like, the old adage of the proof is in the pudding, because I think a lot of times, and this is back to, I think, expectations, meaning outside versus inside. I think we all, and we know this is true, and if you've kind of followed like some of Bronnie Ware's like book and her piece, right? Like, we get easily caught in outside expectations, like what people expect of us, what society expects, family, friends, peers, coworkers. What I mean is like, hey, it should, if I have a family, it should be family, it should be kids, it should be love, whatever it is, right? Well, that's okay. And that's fine if those are really yours, but like, what are yours? And so that is why I want to see someone telling me this. And then from there, this is where the human piece comes in. It's a great starting point, but then what we do is have a dialogue on it, right? Where we're going to talk through it, have a conversation. And I think what's really interesting is a few of those conversations then go back of like, hey, how are those reflective and different than when you were in your 20s, 30s, 40s? If you've had children, how were they different than pre and post, right? And it's really about starting to help people also understand that we are on a little bit of a glide path. They can change. I understand like you want them to be anchored, but they can change over time too, as we change. So what's interesting is in that conversation, what I often see is like, we'll have a shift in the stack rank, right? Or may replace, because to your point about what you just kind of shared about kind of the beach house, for example, right? Like through some of the questioning and the conversation and the listening, what people will do is like guide themselves to say, well, it sounded like this, but now that after I go through this, it's actually this. And I think that's the piece that the real kind of growth and work comes through on. And what I find is when people then go through that first exercise, and it's something integrated here in terms of just the planning process, but it's also the foundational and starting point of the coaching program too, is it really kind of sets a tone. Because when people like go through it, and especially if they get vested and take it very serious, is like it resonates, and it's like, oh, now I see why I made some of these decisions that I have made, or it's why I'm starting to think the way I think, right? It's connecting the dots for people. And I think that's the big piece of this. And back to the pillars of like, when we think about those four pillars and understanding the importance structurally, they all have to be connected and they all have to be strong to get to where you want to go. So I think that's a long-winded component of it, but I think you can start with Googling. You can try that approach. I think it's important, if you have someone to kind of bounce these ideas, whether it's your spouse, whether you do it as a family, whether you do it with an advisor, right? Whoever it is, I think there is that important part of the storytelling and the narrative. I think storytelling is one. I think it's truly, I would wholeheartedly agree, like, it's one of your superpowers, from my time getting to know you and listening and following along. But I also think it is one of the most important things that we can do, because like when we learn to tell our own story and we listen to other stories, there's so much learning and growth that can come from it. And I think that's the other piece that dialogue and that coaching and that conversation brings to it, right? Like, you are now learning to tell your own story, and it's these tools that help you tell it.
And not only tell your own story, but write your own story. Like, I think when you focus on the old 4 pillars, acquiring, protecting, growth, pass along, you're not holding your pen. Like, I have these pens I made that says you've got the pen based off my poem. But when you focus on spirit, mind, body, and the money component, and you're addressing those, and that becomes your definition of wealth, because of how well you get to know yourself, you now get to not only tell, but write the story. And I think it's that there's a difference in my mind between telling your story and writing your story. And they can be the same. You can be writing the story you're telling, but I think a lot of people are telling the story that is being written for them. And again, going back to my always writing the middle and not wanting to upset people, for some people, it might be okay to have their story written for them. Like, maybe they're not comfortable and confident at this stage of life writing their own story. But I think that I want to see more people write their own story. That all comes back to spirit, mind, body, and money. Really spirit, mind, body, and then money kind of just fits in there because money touches everything. But to me, as we talked about earlier, that's kind of on the bottom. So, no, I mean, I'm gonna wrap this up. I know you're busy and you got to get going, and I've got Roman. I got to take the basketball training here in a little bit because that's important to me. But I mean, obviously, we've had a number of conversations. The podcast we had together was awesome. I'm a big fan, and when I found out what Journey was doing, the way you guys are doing it, spirit, mind, body, money, I was like, this is awesome. So I thought it was a conversation I was really excited to have. I don't think this will be the last time you're on Life Design Plus, because I think that just when we have our conversations off camera, that's going to spur things where, like, we need to tell everybody else. So I'm looking forward to more conversations with you in the future. If people want to learn more about the work that you're doing, follow your writing, more about Journey Wealth, like, where should I send them in the show notes?
Yeah, I mean, you can find some of it on journeywealth.com, www.journey-wealth.com. A lot of my writing goes on my LinkedIn profile. We're doing a little bit. I'm trying to take a lesson from you on branding, so we're trying to go through a little bit of that right now and do a better job. That's something I'm getting integrated into. I love the writing and the content creation. My execution on some of those things maybe not as well designed, but those are probably the 2 landing spots right now. We do a newsletter that we push out. You can find all the old versions of that on, again, Journey Wealth site. And we also have a podcast, the Journey podcast, that is out there.
All right. I jotted those down. I knew all of those, so I wasn't going to miss anything. But those will all be in the show notes. So head over to the show notes, links to all of those. Any closing thoughts you want to have before I turn you free?
No, man, I would say hopefully this met expectations. I think, to your point, fundamentally and foundationally, the 4 pillars are the starting point. But I think it's the old tip of the iceberg, right? There's so much to unpack. And I think the conversations that you and I have had, which I truly enjoy, to your point, like finding someone who is aligned in this perspective and this approach. And more importantly, what I hope to think is, like, we're doing it in a space that it's not commonplace yet, and hopefully we can maybe help steward it to be more common in this world, right? Like, because I think the impact and the ripple and the butterfly effect is there. It's just we got to get it moving in that direction. So thank you for the opportunity. I truly appreciate it.
Of course. And it exceeded expectations, because all I really wanted to do today was plant the seed that there's a different way to think about your wealth. I'm not the only person out there, even though I thought I was, that believes spirit, mind, body, and money need to be aligned when it comes to finances. So just planting that seed, like we could do a series together on just one episode on spiritual and just diving deeper and exercises. And maybe we do that over, a period of time, but you more than exceeded expectations. It was awesome to get to chat with you. And I agree that this may not be the norm yet, but I honestly believe this is the future of financial planning. Because you talked about, like, value, and with technology and, like, the technical stuff, that is going to be less and less valuable. You'll need people to kind of crunch and interpret it. But I think helping people maximize life versus maximize their spreadsheet is going to be valuable. And I believe more and more people are going to want it, especially once they know there's advisors and companies out there doing it. Like, they don't know what they don't know. How can they know they want it if they've never heard a financial advisor incorporate all this stuff? But, I think coming out of COVID, and maybe it's changing generation, and maybe the universe is in some shift, but I see, and maybe it's because it's where I'm at, so you see what you're attracted to. I see more people interested in taking control of their life, living life on their terms, doing the things they feel called to do. And if that fits society's norm, great. But if not, they don't care. And I think not feeling like you have to fit a norm is going to lead more people towards this type of work. Like, okay, we don't have to be in society's norm. I've got all these friends doing things their way. I want to do things my way, but I don't know what my way is, or I don't know how to make it happen. And I need a firm that's going to help me figure those things out. So we're early, my friend. Just got to stick with it.
That's all right. And I think it's funny. I know you were recently at Walden, and I just was thinking about that quote, and we traded it. But I just think we're both listening to the same drummer a little bit. Maybe we can help everyone else. I know you're a music guy. Maybe we can help everyone else find that sound a little bit.
I like it. Mine would be more of the beats, but same thing.
It's still rated the drum, right?
Exactly.
Like, we're good.
Exactly. All right, Adam. Thank you for the time. Everybody, make sure you follow Adam. I'll have all the links to follow him, and I really appreciate it. Looking forward to diving deeper into these things as time goes on. Either be off camera or put it on camera so people can hear as well. If you want to hear more about it, let me know in the comments. Say, hey, yeah, we want more from Adam. Let's hear more about it. Like, put in the comments, and that lets me know that you all actually want it, because I want it, but if you don't want it, I don't have to share it with you either. So
if there's one person at least, I'll make sure to let me know. I'll tell my wife at least someone's listening. So
there you go. All right. Well, hey, man, have a great rest of the day. Everybody, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.